I've been spending a little bit of time recently looking at Elijah. And I seem to have been doing a bit of a zigzag through his life. But anyway, we are going to be a bit more logical this week, because if you were here last week, you would have known that I think I called it From the Frying Pan into the Fire, because we looked at the section where Elijah had prophesied drought on the land. And the consequence of that prophecy was that he had to flee. And the prophets in the land, if you remember, were being hunted and killed by Jezebel, who was married to King Ahab. And the worship of Baal had been introduced into the land by Jezebel. So Elijah made this prophecy, and then the word of the Lord came to him, and he went to the Kerith ravine, a place meaning cut off, separated. And this is a place in the desert, but the thing about this place was that there was a mountain stream, and it was the place of God's provision for him for that time. And he was fed by the ravens, and then the brook dried up. I'm not going to re-preach last week's sermon, but it is just what we looked at last week. The brook dried up, and we spent a little bit of time looking at what the drying brook might mean in our own lives. And then we saw that when the word of the Lord came to Elijah, he moved from that place. And we stopped at the point where he knew his destination, but we didn't go beyond that. And it was at that point I said that it was the frying pan to the fire, because the place that the Lord was telling him to go was Zarephath. And this place means fiery trials, or the fiery furnace. And so we pondered, drying brook to fiery furnace. It's not exactly an appealing journey, is it? And it was a distance of about 100 miles. And we looked at the fact that Elijah had got to walk through the land of Israel, which was the land where the prophets were being hunted. And he was being called to this place that is just a few miles from Jezebel's hometown. So there was lots about his destination that was not very attractive, and potentially a dangerous journey. So leaving this place of isolation, that was also a place of provision, a place where he met God, and going to a place whose name means fiery trials. So reading from Kings. Sometime later, the brook dried up, because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar, so that I may have a drink?" As she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you've said. But first, make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord gives rain on the land." She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Interesting, isn't it? The Lord called Elijah to to go to Zarephath. He gave Elijah the destination, but gave him absolutely no details of the journey. Nothing about the in-between bit, nothing about how to get there. Just, this is where you are to go. No sat-nav, just go there. And when I was looking at this the other day, it reminded me of, many of you know that before I came to Crowhurst, I was working at a place called Burswood. And I very, very clearly heard the word of the Lord that he was calling me to go to Burswood to work there. And that was all I heard. You will one day work in this place. Nothing about how, nothing about what I was to do in the meantime, nothing about when. And it was 10 years before that came about. And all that time in the middle, thinking, I'm here. How on earth am I going to get there? Because I don't seem to be on the right path. And yet, I was on the right path. And so I think I understand something of Elijah's story. This is where you are to go, but you have to find your way there. So when God calls us, we have to journey in faith when we hear the destination. Not a little trepidation, probably, but we have to keep our eyes on him. And no doubt, as Elijah made his way across the land, there would have been many questions in his mind. At least there would have been in my mind if I was in his shoes. He did at least know who he was looking for. A widow. Now that's not promising, is it? Not much to go on. A woman in a pagan land, so probably quite unlikely to share his faith. And widows were not known for being rich. They weren't known for having very much. And yet, God was saying, this woman will provide for you. So I sat there thinking, well, if I was in Elijah's shoes, what would be going through my mind then, through this journey? Where will I meet her? How big is this place anyway? Where do I start? How do I find her? How will I recognize her? Is she expecting me? I don't suppose she'll be wearing a carnation in her buttonhole or a red jacket or, any of those things that these days we might say, I'll be wearing a carnation if I don't know what you look like. Do I need to write my name on a placard like people do at the airport, How do I introduce myself? Hello, I'm Elijah. Are you the widow I'm looking for? No, that doesn't sound right, does it? That sounds more like a chat-up line. Hello, I'm Elijah. Are you expecting me? Hello, I'm Elijah. Has God told you that I'm coming? None of them sound like good starting places, do they? But Elijah, as we know, was a man of God. In fact, he carried the very name of God in his name. Elijah means, my God is Yahweh, my God is Jehovah. So he carries the very mark of God in his name. And we know that he walked by faith. After all, if God can command ravens to keep me going and to feed me by a brook, then surely he can do this. Even if I don't understand it, I don't understand how it's going to work out, I don't understand how I'm going to know this woman, but if God can bring the ravens to feed me, then he must surely be able to do this. And it says Elijah came to the town gate, which was the entry place into the town. And there, perhaps he pauses and he sees a widow gathering sticks. It sounds like she was perhaps the first one that he encountered. Isn't that kind of God? Although Elijah at this point didn't know that it was the woman. But it is the kindness of God. And Elijah calls out to her. It's a bit strange, I think, in our culture, but in the culture of the day, This would not have been unnatural, a stranger in a town to ask somebody that lived in the town for a drink. After all, you wouldn't know perhaps where the well was. Jesus did that, didn't he, when he met the woman of Samaria? He asked her for a drink. It was a common thing and a common courtesy to supply. So he used the custom of the day. He called to her. In fact, the meaning of that word is much stronger than just hello. It's a beseeching. It's an imploring. Bring me some water. I dare say he was thirsty. And the woman, according to the customs of the hospitality of the day, complied with his request. And as she was going to get the water, I wonder if this was the God prompt, Elijah calls to her again. Can you bring me some bread? I wonder if you know that God prompt in your own life, when suddenly you're prompted to say something and it's the key to unlock the situation. You don't know it, you don't recognize it until afterwards, but suddenly there it is. And it opens up the way. And her heart, her despair pours out. Her poverty, she's gathering sticks to make her last meal, and then they're going to eat, she and her son are going to eat the meagre supplies that they have left, and then she expects to die. Starvation. After all, there's drought in the land. There's hopelessness there, isn't there? There's despair, resignation even. She recognizes the inevitability of what's going to happen to her life. And she also recognizes Elijah's God, because she says, as surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread. And yet, she doesn't absolutely categorically deny his request. And it's at this point that I think Elijah could come across as just a tad insensitive, because this woman has poured out her heart to Elijah. She's poured out her despair. She's poured out how little she has left. And Elijah says to her, go home and do as you've said, but first make a small cake of bread for me. Haven't you heard what she said? Haven't you understood, Elijah, that this woman has nothing left? Doesn't he understand her complete poverty and despair? But he is a prophet. And then the prophetic word comes. If you do this, the jar of flour will not fail, the jug of oil will not dry up. He knew of God's provision at the brook. I wonder if she had any precedent in her life whatsoever for taking a step of faith, for trusting a man she'd never met before, for trusting in his God who she didn't know. Had she any precedent for that? And yet somehow she did. She did it. And the hand of God provided. And there was a quiet miracle. Isn't that lovely? A quiet miracle. God could have filled all her vats of flour and all her barrels of oil in one miraculous provision. But it doesn't seem that he did that. Maybe that would have brought the whole thing to the attention of the villagers, and she would have had queues and queues down the street. And maybe that's not what God wanted. Maybe God wanted them to trust every single day. That maybe today this is the last of the flour, and maybe today this is the last of the oil. Because ultimately her ability to trust Elijah and his ability to trust God brought the provision. And we haven't read this bit, but it is the means by which her own son, when he dies, in the story that comes next, Elijah is there on hand to restore him. Because it seems that he lived with her, he stayed with her. Or at least he was very close by. Had she not done that, Elijah may not well have been there when her son died. She didn't know that that was coming. So I wonder what we can learn from this. There's something, I think, about God's call to a destination, and somehow we have a journey of faith to make to get there, where there may not be very many signposts along the way. Maybe there's something in your life that needs God's supply. And this is about looking at the supplier, not on the lack of supply that we have. Maybe you're walking in Elijah's footsteps, blindly at this moment following a call that you have a sense of where you're going, but you don't know why you're going. Maybe you're the widow. Maybe you are the widow who is completely wrung out, completely in poverty in one way or another. Because it doesn't just have to be in material things, does it? And yet God seems to be asking something of you, and you're saying, Lord, why are you asking me this? Because I have nothing from which to give. And yet the Lord is asking it anyway. So whatever situation you're in, I'm in, we're in, we know the God who provides. And he is faithful. Faithful one, so unchanging. The same in Elijah's day, the same today. Ageless one, you're my rock of peace. Lord, I depend on you. I'm not going to look at my problem, I'm going to look at you.